My mother, what is the phrase? She isn't quite herself today. But she's harmless.
Psycho's Norman Bates, one of the most memorable movie characters in history.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
Brought to life by Anthony Perkins, Alfred Hitchcock, and a protégé of HP Lovecraft, Norman Bates shocked audiences when he first appeared in 1960.
It was like a circus. A circus.
And he found an unexpected second life in sequels.
It's 22 years later, and Norman Bates is coming home.
And in series.
We own a motel, Norman Bates.
And while Norman the character was known for his dark, deadly secrets, actor Tony Perkins carried secrets of his own.
I think he was the most tormented person about his sexuality I've ever known.
From a forbidden romance with a Hollywood hunk,
My relationship with Tony, I never discussed with anyone.
to having more in common with Norman Bates than the public knew.
He was becoming Norman Bates.
This is the story of Norman Bates, how cinema's greatest psycho was brought to life, and how he lives on today, even after his creators are gone.
Psycho had a way of doing wonderful things for everybody connected with it. It also did awful things.
It's February 25th, 1959, and a Paramount Pictures script reader named William Pinkard is aghast. Pinkard's job is to read popular new books and decide whether Paramount should adapt them into films. He's just finished a recently published novel entitled Psycho, and he is horrified by what he found. The book was written by a famed horror writer named Robert Bloch, a friend and protégé of another author known for creepy ideas, HP Lovecraft. The book's about a man named Norman Bates, who owns a hotel in the middle of nowhere, commits gruesome murders, and enjoys a grotesque relationship with his mother. The novel features a graphic beheading, brazen sexuality, grave robbing, and an element that would have been particularly shocking to audiences in the 1950s, cross-dressing. Pinkard's ruling on the Norman Bates book: too repulsive for films and impossible to adapt. And with that, Paramount decided they would pass. But no sooner had Pinkard submitted his report than a phone rang in an executive's office. It was Alfred Hitchcock, who was under contract to deliver Paramount one more film of his choosing, and he was calling to let them know that he decided it would be an adaptation of Psycho. Why this book? Well, by the late 50s, Hitchcock was one of the most powerful directors in Hollywood. He was known worldwide as the master of suspense, and he was coming off of hits like Strangers on a Train, Dial M for Murder, Vertigo, North by Northwest, many of which had some not-so-subtle queer subtext, and check out my video on Rope for more about that. But what few people knew at the time was that Hitchcock was worried his best work was behind him. Some new directors were starting to outdo him with low-budget thrillers, folks like William Castle, who packed audiences in with cheap flicks like Macabre and House on Haunted Hill. And in Europe, a director named Henri-Georges Clouzot had just released a shocking crime thriller called Les Diaboliques that critics loved. In fact, some critics hailed Clouzot as the new master of suspense. Hitchcock was on the verge of being replaced by a new style of filmmaker.
Face it, lady, we're younger and faster.
That's when Alfred Hitchcock came across a New York Times review of the book Psycho. He was intrigued, not just by the gory details, but especially with the sinister main character. Hitch knew Norman was so shocking that most directors could never get away with adapting this book. But he could, thanks to his unique clout and his connections. Paramount executives who had just finished rejecting Psycho were not thrilled. At a meeting, they told Hitchcock that if this was how he planned to fulfill his contract to them, they wouldn't contribute any money to the budget. That was fine, he said. He'd spend his own money.
Face it, girls. I'm older and I have more insurance.
All he needed Paramount to do was distribute it to theaters. And even though the executives still didn't like the idea of adapting Psycho, this was too good of a deal for them to pass up. And they said, fine. But privately, they wondered, how could Hitchcock possibly pull this off? His production staff wondered the same thing. After the meeting, Hitchcock's head of production, Joan Harrison, reportedly told him, "This time you've gone too far." But Hitchcock had a plan. He started by gathering a crew, not a film crew, but the TV crew from his show Alfred Hitchcock Presents. The plan, he told them, was to shoot this movie like an episode of the show. Fast, cheap, and in black and white. Next, he went looking for a screenwriter who could adapt the story. But nobody he met with seemed to understand Norman's character. They all wrote Norman as he is in the book, a disgusting, mostly one-dimensional monster. But Hitchcock was looking for a character with more psychological depth. And then he had a meeting with a young man named Joseph Stefano. Stefano had started out as a songwriter, and he was trying to break into screenplays. And when he arrived at Hitchcock's office, he awkwardly confessed he wasn't sure why he was there because he hated the novel. That got Hitchcock's attention. Stefano said the book made Norman too hard to sympathize with, that he wanted to explore Norman's psychology. Without realizing it, Stefano was telling Hitchcock exactly what the director was looking for. He told Stefano, get to work. The next step was casting. Hitchcock was able to hire some actors for next to nothing, like his daughter, Pat, who would play a pill-popping secretary.
He said to me, there's a part in the new picture that I would love you to do. He had picked me for that part.
Other actors Hitchcock got for cheap because they were unknowns, like an obscure ex-ventriloquist named Tadeusz Vladislav Konopka, who played a cop in one scene at the end of the film. This was 10 years before Konopka became better known under his stage name for a different role.
A little song, a little dance, a little seltzer down your pants.
Hitchcock also called in actors who were already under contract to him, like Vera Miles to play a worried sister, and actors who were under contract to Paramount, like John Gavin to play a handsome hardware store owner. Although that role nearly went to another young heartthrob, Leslie Nielsen.
Haven't seen anything like this since the Anita Brad concert.
For the role of Marion Crane, a woman who gets embroiled in the hotel's murderous secrets, Hitchcock reached out to the biggest star he thought he could afford, Janet Leigh. Janet was a big name, and usually got $100,000 for a role. That's around $1 million in today's money. For this part, Hitchcock could only offer a quarter of that. But
I didn't even have to read it, but I did. Only because the opportunity of working with Mr. Hitchcock was enough for me.
That left just one more role to fill, that of Norman, or as Hitchcock liked to call him, Master Bates. The role called for a sensitive, shy young man struggling to hide a horrifying secret. And for the part, they'd need an actor who could walk a delicate line between tender and menacing, to suggest an inner struggle, to repress something frightening.
And Hitchcock said, what would you think of Tony Perkins?
Tony was an unlikely choice for a violent thriller. At the time, he was known pretty much exclusively as a sweet romantic lead, one of the biggest up-and-coming hunks in Hollywood. But Hitchcock was onto something here, because, like Norman, Tony had a secret that scared him. And before we can get into that, first, we need to talk about Tony's life before he was famous. Born in 1932, Tony Perkins dove into acting when he was young as a way to feel close to his father. His dad, Osgood Perkins, was a famous stage and screen actor who appeared in major films like the original Scarface. Then, in 1937, when Tony was just 5 years old, Osgood appeared in a stressful opening night performance of a play called Susan and God. He stepped off stage and said, "Thank God we'll never have to go through that again." And later that night, he collapsed and died of heart failure. In the years that followed, Tony lived in his father's shadow, constantly compared to him.
I embraced acting as a profession because he had a lot of scripts left over. And I would read these scripts, and it didn't seem that difficult to make sense out of spoken dialogue.
He was raised by his mother, Janet, with whom he was very close, and Janet's longtime companion, a woman named Michaela, who moved in after Osgood died. Tony started acting professionally as a teen, usually playing quiet, troubled roles, and then, when he was 22, he had a breakout success in the Broadway play Tea and Sympathy, playing a probably gay young man who wants desperately to butch up and be straight. It probably helped that Tony had a personal connection with that material. He'd been secretly dating men for a couple of years, but it was the 1950s, and that sort of thing had to be kept hidden. When he was in college, there was a huge scandal, and a bunch of Tony's gay classmates were discovered and expelled. Tony just barely managed to escape detection. After his Broadway success at age 22, he wanted to get into movies, like his dad. As it happened, movie studios were looking for a new kind of leading man in the mid-50s. Following the mold of James Dean, they wanted stars who were sensitive, emotionally turbulent, artistic. It was a kind of leading man that was often called Psy guys. Tony was exactly what they were looking for.
Everybody in Hollywood wanted him in their films because he was so impressive.
Paramount quickly signed him to a $15 million contract, and overnight, he went from a New York stage actor to a massive international star.
Tony Perkins is 25 years old and perhaps the hottest property in motion pictures.
For the next few years, he played romantic lead roles opposite other big stars like Audrey Hepburn and Jane Fonda, but he never seemed to have as strong a connection to those parts. One reason for that disconnect? In real life, he was dating another Hollywood hunk, Tab Hunter.
Well, I would see him quite a lot. He would stay at my place, got an apartment around the corner. Then I would go back east. I'd stay with Tony at his place.
Tony and Tab had met at a hotel pool and were inseparable. But they had to maintain the pretense that they were just good friends. They were always both cautious about hiding their tracks.
Do you have many friends, Tony?
Not a tremendous amount. The ones I do have, I know I can count on.
Though the public had no idea what was going on, gossip travels fast in Hollywood.
When I first saw Tab and Tony, I knew that they were more than friends. It was pretty obvious.
When executives at Paramount heard what their $15 million star was up to, they were furious. They summoned Tony to a meeting and insisted that he stop seeing Tab. Tony reportedly told them, "But I love him," and walked out, leaving them stunned.
Daddy, I love him!
No.
Trying to make the best of things, publicity agents sent Tony and Tab on double dates with other actresses.
Tab and Tony and I went out together. I suppose I was a beard, but I was happy to be a beard because we were having a good time.
Studios planted news stories about how Tony was seldom seen out with women because he was just so dedicated to his career and to his mother, who had always wielded a lot of control over his life. But those publicists really had their work cut out for them in crafting a heterosexual good boy image for Tony. He had very little interest in being a wholesome leading man. His preference was for more daring, unusual roles. And he got a reputation pretty quick for being artistic and, frankly, weird.
One day at a posh press luncheon, you set about eating spaghetti with your hands.
Newspaper articles described him having emotional blow-ups, hitchhiking barefoot through Los Angeles.
You once dumped a bucket of water over the head of actress Shirley MacLaine.
He denied all of that.
That's false.
But clearly there was a huge difference between public Tony and private Tony. That made him a fitting choice for the character of Norman, who seems friendly and shy, but hides a secret side that frightens him. When Hitchcock approached him, Tony was intrigued. He'd been looking to get out of the romantic lead roles and into something with a little more depth. He also had reservations over the violence and the cross-dressing. But the more he talked it over with Hitchcock, the more he realized how much he could bring to the part.
Tony brought to Norman, depths that I don't think any writer could even imagine. He gave Norman even wit and humor.
In the end, he decided he'd take it. And that was a decision that would completely transform not just his life, but the future of the film industry. Shooting got underway in November of 1959. Our story starts in Phoenix, the first of many Bird references, and we meet our heroine, Marion Crane. She's having a secret romance with a man named Sam. We meet them in their underwear, a shocking sight for 1959, and even more unusual, though they're not married, the dialogue makes it clear they just had sex.
So he kind of took me aside and he said, "I'm not quite getting the passion. Do you think you could, do something?" And I said, "Well, I'll do my best."
And she really did. It's a very steamy scene. According to Janet, they had to stop filming at one point because she was getting her co-star too aroused. In this opening scene, we learn that Marion is ashamed of all this sneaking around, and she's desperate to marry. But Sam's deep in debt, and he can't support her as a wife. Until he can pay off his debts, he says they'll have to keep meeting in secret in hotels. Marion's very unhappy about that. At this point in the film, it might seem like the worst possible hotel-related thing that could possibly happen to her. And by the way, if you don't want Psycho spoilers, now's the part where you might want to pause this video and watch the movie. I have a link to it streaming in the description. A solution presents itself later that day at work. Marion works at a real estate office, and we see that she's not the only one there with a secret. Her co-worker's on drugs.
My mother's doctor gave them to me the day of my wedding. Teddy was furious when he found out I'd taken tranquilizers.
The boss has a hidden bottle of booze.
Where's that bottle you said was in your desk? Oh.
And one of their clients only deals in cash, so he can keep his money hidden from the IRS.
I never carry more than I can afford to lose.
I declare.
I don't. That's how I get to keep it.
Hitchcock's showing us, in this world, everyone has a hidden side. That client with the cash hands Marion $40,000. That's about $500,000 in today's money, and says he's using it to buy his daughter a new house for a wedding present. Marion says she'll take the money to the bank for safekeeping, but instead she packs up and leaves town. Her destination? Sam's hardware shop in Central California. With that money, she thinks, they can start a new married life together. But is she really gonna get away with this? Her whole drive there, it seems like everyone's staring at her. Her boss notices her leaving town, a cop watches her on the road. Hitchcock even shot the headlights of other cars to look like eyes staring her down. Finally, exhausted and off the main highway, Marion pulls into an otherwise empty hotel. And that's where she meets a man who knows a thing or two about keeping secrets. Norman Bates runs the hotel and lives with his mother in a house up on the hill. Seems like a nice enough boy.
If you want anything, just tap on the wall. I'll be in the office.
Thank you, Mr. Bates.
Norman Bates.
He even offers to share some dinner with Marion.
Nothing special, just sandwiches and milk.
Though his mother can't tolerate her son spending time with a woman.
By candlelight, I suppose, in the cheap erotic fashion of young men with cheap erotic minds.
Mother,
Please.
Mrs. Bates hates the very thought of what men and women might do together.
Oh, I refuse to speak of disgusting things because they disgust me.
It's like Norman's mom is scolding the sexually adventurous characters in the movie, maybe even the audience for enjoying it so far. And most of all, she's scolding her son.
Go tell her she'll not be appeasing her ugly appetite with my food or my son.
The voice of Mrs. Bates, by the way, is a combination of multiple actors whose voices Hitchcock mixed together. Two of them are women who did a lot of voice acting, and the third is a friend of Tony's, Paul Jasmine. Years earlier, Paul had created an old lady character that he used for prank phone calls, and he and Tony would sometimes get together with their friends, Stanley Kubrick and Elaine Stritch, and call Rosalind Russell. I would give my life to hear just 1 minute of those conversations.
Now get this, you double-crossing chimpanzee.
Anyway, Norman returns and apologizes for his mother.
My mother, what is the phrase? She isn't quite herself today.
He invites Marion into the back office for a little dinner, and a conversation that will completely change the course of the film. It starts with some small talk about Norman's hobbies.
My hobby is stuffing things. You know, taxidermy.
How he spends his time.
Do you go out with friends?
Well, a boy's best friend is his mother.
And how he's stuck there, miserable, taking care of a mother who's endlessly cruel to him. In a moment of honesty, he tells Marion,
I think that we're all in our private traps, and none of us can ever get out.
Marion starts to feel sorry for Norman.
I don't mind it anymore.
Oh, but you should. You should mind it.
Oh, I do, but I say I don't.
The more she hears him talk about how he's trapped there with his mother, the more she realizes she's walking into a trap of her own with that stolen money. Deep down, she knows she'll never get away with it.
We all go a little mad sometimes, haven't you?
Yes. Sometimes just one time can be enough.
But maybe she thinks it's not too late for her. Marion tells Norman she'll be driving back to Phoenix in the morning.
I stepped into a private trap back there, and I'd like to go back and try to pull myself out of it.
The two say goodnight, and Marion heads back to her room. And that's where they leave it. Or at least, that's what they both think. Psycho's known for some pretty big, flashy scenes, especially the one that's coming up next. But I think this parlor conversation is actually the best scene in the movie. For one thing, there's the clever double meaning, or maybe triple meaning, of the dialogue. Norman talks about how he's trapped where he is. And those lines neatly apply to Marion's life, too. But they also apply to the real-life Anthony Perkins. From minor biographic details that are identical to his own.
She had to raise me all by herself after my father died. I was only 5, and it must have been quite a strain for her.
To dialogue that could easily describe being trapped in the Hollywood closet.
We're all in our private traps.
And having to put on a happy face for the public.
You should mind it.
Oh, I do, but I say I don't.
It's like this dialogue was written for him. And in fact, some of it was. Prior to writing the script, Joseph Stefano had seen Tony on stage and crafted Norman's dialogue with him in mind even before Tony was cast. Tony even rewrote some of the dialogue to suit his understanding of Norman. The scene even ends on an optimistic note, that when we find ourselves stuck in a trap, it might be possible someday to escape. But for Marion, things don't quite work out that way. But hold on, we're not quite there yet. After the parlor scene, Marion heads back to a room for a shower. Norman stays behind, and there's a subtle reference here. He stands near a painting of Susanna and the Elders, a Bible story about a woman who's accosted while bathing. Norman looks uncomfortable, and in Stefano's script, Norman's described as reluctant, trying to resist something. But then he gives in and removes the painting from the wall. Through a hidden peephole, he sees... Norman looks away, and now the script describes him as resentful, angry, anguished, as he turns to look back at the house where he's trapped with his mother. And then comes the first of the very big twists. Marion's taking a cleansing shower, getting ready to head back to Phoenix in the morning, reborn. But Mrs. Bates would like a word. There in the shower, Marion's attacked, stabbed repeatedly, and when Mrs. Bates leaves, Marion is slumped over the tub, dead. Just like that, our heroine is out of the picture. Hitchcock knew this sequence needed to be perfect, and he used a bunch of innovative techniques to give it maximum impact, from body doubles to film played in reverse to strategically place stickers on Janet Leigh's body, and a clever use of vegetables.
He had the prop man bring different melons, and, he would stab the melons.
We don't have time to go into all the tricks that Hitchcock pulled out for the sequence, but I'll be posting a bonus video over on Patreon going behind the scenes on the making of the shower scene. That's all at patreon.com/mattbaum. The impact of these approximately 45 seconds on the audience is hard to overstate, especially back in the 1960s when nobody knew what was about to happen. The movie's not even half over. We've just seen the main character, the one person we were following, killed. Without Marion, how can this movie possibly go on? But go on it does. Norman stumbles upon the scene and disposes of Marion's body. And without realizing it, he also disposes of the money, having no idea it ever existed. A week passes. Private Eye comes looking for Marion, and for the money. He heads up to the house to ask Mrs. Bates some questions, but Mrs. Bates doesn't want to talk to him either. Norman hides the investigator's body in the swamp too. Must be getting kind of crowded at this point, and worried that more people are going to come, Norman moves his mother down to the fruit cellar, which leads to some more double-meaning dialogue.
I will not hide in the fruit cellar. You think I'm fruity, huh?
Norman's troubles still aren't over. Marion's sister Lila's looking for her, and she teams up with Marion's boyfriend, Sam. They track Marion down to the hotel. Lila wants to look for Marion at the old house, so Sam keeps Norman distracted, and watch how cruisy this dialogue is.
Wife's taking a nap, and I never could keep quiet enough for her, so I just thought I'd look you up and talk.
Good.
While the boys get to know each other, Lila sneaks into the house. She finds Mrs. Bates hiding in the fruit cellar. And in the movie's second huge twist, we finally meet Norman's mother face to face. Mrs. Bates, it turns out, was a mummified corpse. So who was committing the murders? It was Norman, dressed as his dead mother. He comes in to kill Lila, but Sam subdues him just in time. In a final scene, Norman's apprehended, and the police try to figure him out with the help of a psychiatrist.
He's a transvestite.
Not exactly.
The psychiatrist explains that there are really two people inside Norman. 10 years earlier, Norman's mother took up with another man, and Norman grew jealous and killed them both. Then, unable to face what he'd done, he decided his mother was still alive, as a split persona in his mind. And her emergence was triggered by one thing in particular.
If he felt a strong attraction to any other woman, the mother's side of him would go wild.
For now, our last glimpse of Norman shows his face mixed with his mother's as the bodies are pulled from the swamp. This unusual role would come to follow Anthony Perkins for the rest of his life. But for the time being, filming wrapped up in February of 1960, and Hitchcock got to work on the edit. One of his biggest challenges came from censors, first at the studio, and then at the Production Code Administration, also known as the Hayes Office, which decided whether a movie could be shown in theaters. The first battle was over the shower scene. Hitchcock and his staff watched a rough cut with a Paramount executive named Luigi Larashi. When they got to the shower, Luigi leapt up and insisted he saw a full breast. Hitchcock tried to calm him down.
No, you didn't, Luigi. It's just in your dirty mind. You didn't see a breast at all.
And while we're on the subject of people with secret double lives, there's evidence that while Luigi Larashi was working at Paramount, he was also a secret agent for the CIA and would order movies changed to make America look better to overseas audiences. It's never been definitively confirmed, but in any case, Larashi wasn't able to make any changes to Psycho. Hitchcock left the shower scene as is and sent it over to the Production Code Administration for approval. At the PCA, a handful of censors insisted they saw nudity too. Hitchcock told him he'd cut a few shots from the shower scene. But instead, he just waited a couple days and sent over the exact same cut. And this time, this same censors who saw a breast said it was fine. But the biggest fight came over a line at the end of the film.
You won't believe what upset them more than anything else. The word transvestite.
Censors were convinced it was a dirty word. Joseph Stefano had to bring a dictionary to their office and show them that it was a clinical term, a person dressed in clothes associated with another gender. And at that, the censor said, fine. With the release scheduled for September of 1960, Hitchcock still had some secrets on his mind, particularly protecting the surprise twist of the movie's biggest star dying halfway through the picture. At the time, audiences didn't really worry about showtimes. People would just walk into movie theaters whenever they got there, often in the middle of whatever was showing, and they'd sit there long enough for the movie to loop so they could see whatever they missed at the beginning. Hitchcock knew that would probably be the worst possible way to see Psycho. So he borrowed a technique from Clouzot, the French master of suspense. When Les Diaboliques opened in France 5 years earlier, theaters there wouldn't let people in after the movie had started. And Hitchcock insisted on the same rule for Psycho.
I've suggested that Psycho be seen from the beginning. In fact, this is more than a suggestion. It is required.
Theater owners hated that. They were sure they'd lose a ton of money. Who ever heard of waiting in line to see a movie? But Hitchcock insisted. He even teased the audience.
This queuing up and standing about is good for you. It will make you appreciate the seats inside.
He also shot a trailer for the film that heightened the mystery.
You should have seen the blood. The whole place was, well, it's too horrible to describe.
All this build-up and suspense kept audiences wondering, what's so horrifying about this film that even Hitchcock doesn't want to describe it?
Dreadful.
And rather than turning audiences off, people were more eager than ever to see what all the fuss was about. And once they got in, the twists had people in hysterics. Audiences shouted at the screen. Some fled from the theater. There were reports of faintings.
And I was shocked, absolutely shocked. Could not believe that the audience would react like this.
And that was one of the first films I ever saw that said, please do not reveal the ending. It was like a circus. A circus.
The only group that wasn't enthusiastic? Critics.
In fact, the critics had to see it on the day that it opened with the ordinary folk. I'm convinced that we got a lot of bad reviews because of that.
Time magazine called it stomach-churning. Newsweek called it a gimmick. New York Times critic Bosley Crowther called it a blot on Hitchcock's career. The film critic for the British Observer not only walked out of the theater, but resigned as the paper's film critic.
It stinks.
One of the few aspects critics did hail, Tony Perkins' performance. They called him a great talent, the film's top performance, fascinating, the best role of his career. Even negative reviews were intrigued by Norman. The only character of any interest, one wrote. And audiences couldn't get enough. The movie expanded to more theaters, and by the end of the year, it made $14 million. And by the end of the year, even the critics who panned it were talking about the movie very differently. Bosley Crowther, the New York Times critic who called it a blot, wrote a new article hailing Psycho's cinematic artistry, and he put it on his list of the year's best films. Psycho was already taking its place in film history, and Norman's story was only just getting started. The success of Psycho had a big immediate impact. For one thing, it helped popularize movie showtimes like we still use today. It also spawned a lot of imitators, especially among the cheap horror directors that Hitchcock wanted to compete with. In the years that followed, audiences got a rapid string of imitators. There was Homicidal, Deranged, Phobia, The Psycho Lover, Anatomy of a Psycho, Psycho Circus, and so on. Hitchcock proved they weren't taking his place. He was still the master. Psycho also served as inspiration for many more well-regarded films.
Psycho is the film that made me feel that film could be an extremely powerful medium, and it scared the hell out of me.
William Friedkin used Psycho as the basis of a shot in The Exorcist.
I found out how Hitchcock did that effect. He attached the camera to a balsam, and that's what we did in The Exorcist.
Martin Scorsese used the shower scene as the basis for the fight in Raging Bull.
I based it on shot by shot from the shower scene.
And even the distinctive music from the film. Went on to pop up where you would least expect it.
Boy, it's lucky you had these compartments.
One of the most indelible aspects of the film was a Norman. Just the name, Norman Bates, immediately became part of popular culture, shorthand for an unsettling figure, especially one struggling to conceal a secret side. In the years that followed, Norman would be referenced in everything from Bob Dylan songs
There stood Rita looking just like Tony Perkins
to Three's Company.
Some days I feel like a regular Norman Bates.
To Ladybugs.
Looks like Norman Bates is playing soccer.
In the aftermath of the film's success, Tony Perkins found himself living in Norman's shadow. And over the next few decades, it would come to shape his life more and more. At first, the attention seemed great. The role raised Tony's profile even further, and he had some fun with his new image.
Outside of the theater, he'd wait till the theater emptied, and then he'd jump out, from the shadows as Norman, going like, or as Mother, going, ah! And people would go bananas.
But it also made it hard for people to see him as anyone else.
He was Norman Bates, and I don't think the public allowed him to be anything else but. I really do feel that.
Out in public, Tony noticed people avoiding him. Parents would steer their children away. Job offers slowed down because filmmakers thought audiences would only see him as Norman. At one point, when he appeared in a play, the other actors in the cast went to see Psycho, and at the next rehearsal they said they couldn't look at him anymore. That was tough for somebody like Tony, for whom public perception meant a lot.
You mean you worry about people, their reaction to Tony Perkins?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Especially with the press sometimes misrepresenting you.
For the next few years in the 1960s, Tony looked for work in Europe and struggled to find roles on Broadway. Work was spotty. He also cultivated a close social circle, many gay men working on stage and screen. Some were friends, others romantic partners, and among them was an up-and-coming composer named Stephen Sondheim. Perkins and Sondheim shared a love of word puzzles, mysteries, and party games, and they became fast friends. Perkins appeared in one of Sondheim's projects, a musical called Evening Primrose that's set in a department store and is sort of a precursor to the movie Mannequin.
One more mannequin.
What a poem this would make.
And on one occasion, Tony and Stephen organized a giant murder mystery game for all their friends. It was played by traveling in limousines to locations all over New York City. They even invented a party game that involved performing tasks in the dark and identifying a secret saboteur. Kind of a real-life version of Among Us, with Tony playing the murderer. A callback to his role as Norman.
They're thrown out of the airlock. It's a no-brainer.
During those years in the 60s, Tony became more comfortable talking about his sexuality. Not to the public, but to his close friends, like director Sidney Lumet.
And he said, "Oh, I'm homosexual." And from then on, he spoke about it completely openly.
But he also confided in those friends. He felt conflicted about it.
I think he was the most tormented person about his sexuality I've ever known.
Tony wanted to fall in love, have a committed relationship, start a family. But at the time, many people believed that was impossible for gay men. In 1964, a psychologist named Irving Bieber released a book claiming that gay men aren't capable of love and commitment, that they should just try to become straight. Obviously, that's not true, and today Bieber's work has been totally discredited, but for years, it was considered an authoritative source. Most people accepted it as true, including many queer people.
And I think if Tony could have taken a pill when he went to bed and gotten up the next morning straight, he absolutely would have done it.
Tony started seeing a psychotherapist named Mildred Newman, a believer in ex-gay treatment. Instead of helping him accept himself, she started pushing Tony to go straight. And soon enough, Tony met a woman named Barry Berenson, a photographer working for Andy Warhol. They started dating, and during this time, Tony kept seeing his then-boyfriend, Grover Dale, who was also dating a woman. And after a few years, Tony and Barry got married. Grover and his girlfriend also got married, and for a time, the four of them all lived together in one house.
Anita and I lived down in the garden apartment. Tony and Barry lived in the upper duplex. And all of our friends thought we were crazy.
With his wife, Barry, Tony had two sons. One Osgood, named for Tony's dad, and the other Elvis.
Tony took to fatherhood like a fish to water. He just, the whole process of it was just fascinating to him, and he loved it so much.
Tony told people he was straight now.
And he said that period of his life was over with. And I said, "Well, how come, Tony? How did it happen?" He said, "I just didn't want it anymore."
And that was a surprise to his friends since Tony continued to see men the whole time. But everyone could also see that family life made him happy.
They were like any middle-class family that you'd meet anywhere.
By the late 70s, to the public, Tony Perkins looked like a heterosexual family man. In private, he was still seeing men and feeling conflicted. And like Norman, he was struggling with a side that scared him. And then, in the early 1980s, Norman unexpectedly re-entered Tony's life.
It is a rare man whose past does not return to haunt him.
That was thanks in part to Robert Bloch, who wrote the original book of Psycho. In 1982, Bloch published a sequel, Psycho 2. The book had Norman escaping from an asylum and a psychiatrist chasing him to Hollywood, where a director was making a movie based on Bates's life. The whole thing is a satire of slasher films, and Universal, which now held the rights to Psycho, hated it. They told Bloch to abandon the book. But he didn't, and it came out to generally good reviews and sales. Universal decided, all right, we'll make a sequel of our own, totally disconnected from the book. Hitchcock had passed away a few years earlier, but his family gave their blessing, and Universal asked Tony if he'd like to come back to play Norman Bates. Tony wasn't sure about that. He'd spent years trying to separate himself from that role. And while he deliberated, the studio considered other actors for the part. Nearly went to Christopher Walken.
I had enough. I give up. I want to go home.
But ultimately, Tony decided work was scarce, the money was good, and when he saw the script, his interest was piqued.
So I wrote a part. He had a great character arc. It was psychologically based, and Tony Perkins said yes.
The film of Psycho 2 is totally different from the book, and presents a surprising question. Is it possible for Norman to be reformed? The movie starts with Norman released from the asylum, cured, his doctor says. He moves back home to put his life back together, but before long, he's finding notes from his mother, hearing her voice,
Gonna get you for this, Norman!
and struggling to resist unwanted urges.
I'm becoming confused again.
He befriends a young local woman named Mary, played by Meg Tilly. And at first, she seems kind, one of the few people to see Norman's good side. But it later turns out that this woman is secretly the niece of Marion Crane, Norman's victim from the first film. She and her mother Lila are secretly plotting to drive Norman crazy so he'll be locked up again. But the more she gets to know him, the more she sees he's someone who needs help. And she wants no part of this plan.
I'm not living for dead people anymore, Mother. Not for your sister, my father, not even for you.
It's an interesting idea, using Norman's story to examine how people who have passed away can still affect the living. The film ends with a surprise twist that Norman was adopted and his real mother is actually still alive. But not for long. In the end, Norman's back where he was before, caught in a conflict between himself and his mother.
I want to keep my eyes on you. Make sure you don't start playing with filthy girls again.
There are a lot of nice touches in this film. Small details like this tribute to Hitchcock in the shadows, and also a return to how Psycho 1 sprinkled elements of Tony's real life throughout. For example, when Norman has a flashback to his life as a young boy, young Norman is played by his real-life son, Osgood.
Norman, what did you put in my tea?
Making Psycho 2 was a real treat for Osgood and the whole Perkins family.
We toured the world, and he would get up there and talk before the movie, and people were going nuts. And so it's like your dad's Paul McCartney for 10 minutes.
One of the most interesting aspects of this sequel is seeing Norman's greatest fear, that even after trying to reshape himself through years of therapy, he's still who he was before. That the side of his mind that frightens him could come back at any moment.
I actually thought the story of Psycho 2 was very, very good, and because it exonerated Norman, it made him be the guy that things were being done to, and I thought that was a real good deal.
The plot of the film is just okay, but Norman was a standout hit. Audiences were thrilled to see him again.
Anthony Perkins hardly seems to have changed at all since 1960.
When Psycho 2 came out in the summer of 1983, it was a huge success. The #2 movie in the country, only beat by Return of the Jedi. With that warm reception, Tony's attitude toward the Norman character started to mellow. Instead of trying to distance himself from the role, he started to embrace it. In the past few years, he'd occasionally joked around about Norman, like on this 1976 episode of Saturday Night Live.
Hi, I'm Norman Bates for the Norman Bates School of Motel Management.
He appeared in that episode, incidentally, with the Muppets. It's a very weird pairing.
For our next number.
Excuse me, what's your face? Perkins there. Can we talk to you for a second here?
And after Psycho 2, instead of bristling when people called him Norman, Tony started accepting it.
I was able to kind of get the idea that my career and I were two different things. No, that doesn't really get to me anymore, although it used to. It used to really used to bug me.
Now he was far more comfortable being associated with that role.
Now this is oatmeal made my way. Look, Mother, I'm eating my oatmeal.
Now that's a good boy.
And that opened a door for more Norman Bates projects over the next few years. In 1986, Universal asked Tony to come back for another sequel, Psycho 3. And this time, he'd get to direct the film. Psycho 3 opens with Norman living with the new corpse of his mother. He's hired a guy to help run the hotel, a drifter named Duke, who oozes a sort of sleazy sexuality. The camera drinks him in from all angles at every opportunity. Meanwhile, Norman also befriends a woman at a local diner, an ex-nun named Maureen, who abandoned her faith because she was plagued by unwanted cravings.
Hunger's for the flesh, Father.
As Norman and Maureen bond, murders resume at the hotel. Duke reveals to Norman he's found out about Mother and plans to blackmail him. But Mother doesn't like that. Duke gets el-kabonged. Norman's horrified that he's still unable to control his impulses.
I didn't mean it. I didn't want to.
In the end, he attacks Mother.
How dare you
treat your mother in such a way.
And then turns himself in, with the police taking him away to his great relief.
They're gonna have you locked up forever. But I'll be free. I'll finally be free.
And he's got a little souvenir. Psycho 3 is full of intriguing touches, from the extremely thirsty shots of Duke.
You know what I want, and you know what I'll do if I don't get it.
To the casting of Maureen, the ex-nun, with actress Diana Scarwood, someone closely associated with mother-focused films.
I am not one of your fans!
Psycho 3 calls back to the parlor scene of the first Psycho, where Norman first talks about being trapped. Now, he's trapped by his own past.
The past is never really past. It stays with me all the time.
Tormented by things he wishes he could change about himself, but can't.
And no matter how hard I try, I can't really escape. It's always there, throbbing inside you.
And ultimately concludes with him voluntarily entering a different kind of trap. The only way he knows how to be free is to seek out protection from himself. Most of all, it's a fascinating look into Tony's understanding of Norman.
And in his first directing effort, Perkins shows that he knows Norman better than anyone else.
And his understanding of himself.
There's no mistake about how my dad is looking at Jeff Fahey. And all of a sudden, my dad, who had been completely inauthentic with me for so long, was all of a sudden now on a big screen being authentic.
The individual plot beats may not always come together, but as a character portrait, Psycho 3's fantastic.
If Norman Bates could make a movie about Norman Bates as an older guy, it'd probably be really fucking dirty. And good for him.
Psycho 3 was followed by an attempted TV pilot for a Bates Motel series in 1987. This one's a weird departure from the previous films. It totally ignores Psycho 2 and 3, and there's no Norman. Instead, the series is about Norman's friend Alex, played by Bud Cort. That's Harold from Harold and Maude.
Do you enjoy knives?
The show starts with Norman dying and leaving the hotel to his pal Alex. Alex fixes the place up with help from a spunky squatter living in the mansion. She's played by Lori Petty, aka Tank Girl.
Is it true what they say about guys with big shoes?
The tone of the show is all over the place. Sometimes it's a wacky comedy.
Who are you?
Give me that!
Other times, it's quite dark, like when a guest checks in with plans to end her life.
3 marriages, no children. Gray hairs and growing older. Forgive me.
Sometimes it's supernatural. The guest gets talked out of ending her life by a fun-loving gang of teenage ghosts, led by Jason Bateman.
Listen, I've never done this before.
And sometimes it's anti-supernatural. There are a few sightings of the ghost of Mrs. Bates, but she turns out to be a mortgage broker in a mask who was trying to scare everybody away so he could buy the motel for cheap.
There's your ghost, Alex.
Would have gotten away with it if not for those meddling kids. Anyway, in the climax of the pilot, Alex and his friends managed to record the banker confessing to fraud and then use that to issue their demand.
What do you say, a more reasonable payment schedule?
I do appreciate how deranged this pilot is, but overall it really suffers from the lack of Norman. And it highlights how crucial Tony's performance was to the success of all the other films. Fortunately, Tony would come back for one more sequel, Psycho 4, released in 1990. The movie opens with a radio talk show. The subject, boys who kill their mothers. And they get a call from someone with some expertise on the subject.
Oh, I've killed before. And now I'm going to have to do it again.
In this film, which ignores Psychos 2 and 3 and the failed pilot, Norman's been released from the mental hospital. He's trying to live a normal life in the suburbs, seen here in a kitchen that looks like a set from Frasier, and he's even married to a woman. In fact, his wife in the film is the doctor who treated him. No red flags there. The film jumps back and forth between Norman in the 90s and flashbacks to Norman in the 50s. Young Norman is played by Henry Thomas, that's Elliot from E.T., and in the flashbacks, Norman explains what made him what he is. Prolonged boyhood suffering at the hands of a mother who's sometimes terribly cruel.
Look at yourself, boy! Ha! Girl! Yes, girl! Mama's little girl!
Not a girl.
And other times, uncomfortably seductive.
Do my legs first. Start at the ankles.
In the 90s, Norman learns that his wife is pregnant, and he's distraught. His fear is that their kid will be like him. He resolves to kill his wife to stop that from happening. Ultimately, she talks him out of it.
You're not a killer, Norman.
And she persuades him he can break the cycle through therapy and by providing a stable, straight home life. Reviews on this sequel were mixed at best, though once again, critics praised Tony's standout performance. But behind the scenes, during the filming of this final sequel, people close to Tony could tell something was wrong. It was around this time that he got some routine blood work done, and without his knowledge, a lab worker tested his blood for HIV. They found he was HIV positive, and instead of telling him, sold the information to the National Enquirer. Tony found out about his HIV status along with the rest of the country by seeing it one day in a tabloid while he was at the supermarket. At first, the family did what queer people had been doing for years for their own protection. They denied the rumors. They wore disguises to medical appointments so reporters wouldn't see them. And throughout it all, his wife Berry protected him.
I think my mom and dad's story is a genuine one. They loved each other for real. He needed to be hidden, and so she was going to help. I think she probably would have done it forever.
To family and friends, Tony tried to keep a positive attitude. He called the experience an adventure. And he quietly got involved with HIV work, volunteering for groups that provided services to people with HIV, services he knew he would eventually need. Among them was Project Angel Food, which was run by his friend Marianne Williamson. Yes, the one who ran for president.
He grieved the thought that he wasn't going to be there for his sons. But I told him that they had him as long as they needed him, that the essence of who he was had already penetrated their being.
In 1992, Tony celebrated his 60th birthday with a big surprise party in New York, surrounded by his friends.
It was a happy night. I mean, there was a lot of affection and a lot of hugging, and I think the sense of everyone there was that it was a farewell.
Within a few weeks, he was bedridden.
The kind of wonderful passing that his wife Berry provided for him, she just made sure that he was surrounded by people that he loved.
And on September 12th, with his family by his side, Tony passed away at the age of 60. He wrote a short statement to be read after his death.
A week before he died, he wrote, "There are many who believe AIDS is God's vengeance, but I believe it was sent to teach people how to love and understand and have compassion for each other."
And when his friends and family gathered to remember him,
the memorial service there was just such love and celebration of a life. And I think that's the way it should be.
But although Tony was gone, fascination with his work, and especially his portrayal of Norman, endured. The role stayed in public consciousness, still shorthand for a man in conflict with himself who evokes unease in those around him. The American Film Institute named Norman one of the best villains in film history. Norman references continue to permeate pop culture, from slashers...
We all go a little mad sometimes.
...to comedies...
Huh, Norman Bates.
...and everything in between.
If we walk in there and his dead mother is sitting in a rocking chair, not a bit surprised.
And in perhaps the greatest sign of cultural influence, he's been referenced on The Simpsons again... and again.
Surprise boy in bed. And, disembowel him. No, I don't like that bowel in there. Gut him.
And again.
Just wash your hands and get out.
The shower scene in particular is one of the most imitated in movie history. And in 1998, Gus Van Sant even attempted a shot-for-shot remake of Psycho, with Vince Vaughn as Norman. Although it was clear, without Anthony, something was missing.
If there's a role in all of film that you just can't duplicate, it's Norman Bates by Anthony
Everybody
Perkins.
wants to see
it's
him.
It's like somebody else playing Citizen Kane other than Orson Welles.
But duplicate it they did, 15 years later with Bates Motel, a series on A&E that reimagines the Norman Bates story in present-day Oregon. It starts when Norman and his mother buy a hotel. We meet Norman as a nervous but sane young man.
This is crazy, Mom.
Yeah? We own a motel, Norman Bates.
And over the course of the series, we see the injustice of the world break him down. Norman protects his mother as they're beset by violent men, corrupt authority figures, and painful family secrets. Over the 5 years that this series ran, we see Norman's trademark split develop. The gentle public persona, the uncontrollable dark side he desperately wants to contain but can't.
Everyone has multiple personalities, Julia. We pull out what we need when we have to.
The show invites some sympathy for Norman as he falls apart. And to be fair, yes, he does do some murder.
He's crazy.
But the show's suggestion is that he's someone who's lost control, who needs help, and can't get it. Bates Motel was a huge success, and won a bunch of People's Choice Awards and got multiple Emmy nominations. It's the longest-running scripted drama in A&E history. And it's a character that clearly still resonates. Of course, Norman Bates isn't the only character in fiction who struggles with two personas. There's Tons of those, from Dr. Jekyll to Gollum to Batman and Walter White. Those characters are captivating because so many people feel like they too have two sides in conflict. An acceptable public persona and a hidden side that they fight to keep hidden. Of all those characters, Norman remains one of the most iconic and enduring, probably always will, because of how perfectly Tony's performance evokes that feeling. Because he understood it. In making this video, I found a ton of great stories about Norman, Tony, and Hitchcock that I just didn't have room for in this script, like the lengths that Tony and Tab went to in order to hide their romance in the 1950s, to the party games that Tony invented with his friend Stephen Sondheim, plus all the clever tricks that Hitchcock came up with to make the shower scene so memorable, which is why there are so many imitators, but rarely do they look as good as the original. I'll be posting all those stories and bonus videos over on Patreon. That's at patreon.com/mattbaum. Big thanks to all the patrons who make these videos possible, and thanks to everybody who likes and subscribes and comments on YouTube. That is super appreciated. And now, if you'll excuse me, I just heard that Norman's mother is back.
As a call